Yep. What up, y'all? Welcome back to the Bees Like That podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Chris. Oh, today has been one of the days where I feel most like myself. I've been struggling a lot lately with some different things, but I feel pretty good today. So I was like, well, let me record something. Let me record something for the people. First, I want to touch on my take. I was having a conversation with a couple of my colleagues yesterday. And when it comes to matters of recovery, abstinence, sobriety, etc., I do my best to give people my whole experience, meaning everything, the good, the bad, the ugly when it comes to addiction and recovery, because I want, especially for people who don't identify as an individual who is in recovery or suffers or is suffering from active addiction, symptoms of active addiction and physical dependence on substances. I want to give them as much information as possible that will allow them to understand the experience of those like me who are in recovery from these forms of addiction, and also those who aren't in recovery, who are in active addiction, because the version available in real time to experience of a person 100% of the, well, I can't say 100% of the time, but most of the time is not the version most concurrent with the truest version of who they are, like just inherently who they are as people. Because addiction makes us do wacky and weirdo shit, right? So I am in a unique position, being someone in recovery, having come so far spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and professionally from where I was. I'm fortunate that I have people who got to experience me at my lowest and now today, right? So I've seen that there can be a bit of confusion and difficulty for people to process two things being true at the same time. So one thing being contrary to what is typically espoused about recovery or sobriety, abstinence. We'll cover all three. My take on all three. And that is, how can someone be so disconnected, discontent, and just surly in active addiction and stay that way when they're abstinent, when they exercise all the substances out of their lives, at least the ones that, cause us to do wacky stuff. So not things like caffeine, cigarettes, or whatever, but things like fentanyl, heroin, pills, alcohol, that kind of shit. How is it that they can be the same surly version of themselves without the substances? I thought that this stuff was supposed to remedy or like get better, like people were to become more pleasant as time went by, and you put more distance between oneself and their last use. Sometimes it doesn't go that way, and I'll tell you why. This is my take on it. This is how I examine my life regarding all of these things and how it makes sense in my head. So you have abstinence, sobriety, recovery. Abstinence, in my opinion, is simply just the removal of actively using mind or mood altering substances, usually the ones that we're physically dependent on, right? And cause us the most malady in our lives. That's it. We're not taking it any further than that. Sobriety, in my opinion, and as I examine my life again and experience and relate it to you in ways that make sense to me, is a mix of the two, right? So you get a bit more of the spirituality with sobriety, but you're still kind of just sober, right? You still have some of that experience of just like hanging on by the seat of your pants, right? And so you're still growing. Recovery is all three, plus some other really good stuff, right? So the big ones in my mind would be willingness to accept goodness from any source. And that means even the most unlikely. So how I generally make this make sense for people is when working with or viewing or experiencing a person in active addiction, just because they're in active addiction does not mean that they still don't have the ability to say very poignant, true, smart, or helpful things, right? They can still offer things that add value to others' lives, even if it's by way of a lesson, a living lesson that we can look to and examine and be like, hey, I don't want to go there. Goodness from any source. Even people who aren't in active addiction, who may be adjacent to the experience, but are otherwise just not our flavor, right? Like we don't vibe with them very much. However, they still have the capacity to add good to other people's lives. So suspending bias, referencing experience and saying, hey, how can I come together? Where's this common ground, etc. Goodness from any source. Also, being a cheerful and free giver of oneself and one's time. What does that mean to a person in recovery? Simply, it means being of service. What this cannot mean, and if you're familiar with recovery, you will understand that it is commonly held and said in these programs of recovery that I only keep what I have by giving it away, or we only keep what we have by giving it away. That means I am willingly and cheerfully available to be of service, especially to the addict who still suffers, but overall to anyone, to humanity, period, right? What it cannot be is quid pro quo, or I'm only doing this. I know in my heart that I'm only doing this, and this is how you know that you're more on the recovery side than the sobriety and abstinence side, is if you know that your heart genuinely, you accept and acknowledge that you will be able to maintain, this will help you maintain your sobriety and recovery, but you genuinely want to give freely of yourself and your time to be of service to you brothers and sisters. Right? That's the key. And finally, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are like some of, in my opinion, the top ingredients for recovery. Finally, the spiritual transformation or awakening that I talked about in a recent episode. This is not an accident. Certain things must be in place in order for this to happen. Willingness for sure, gratitude for sure, humility for sure, and I don't mean the kind of humility where you just like are self-deprecating and you think that you're just the lowest piece of shit. That's not humility. That's abuse. Anyway, I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. And then the work component. You must do the work. All of these things together with a bunch of other stuff, in my mind, comprise healthy forms of recovery. Now, do these mixes and combinations of things look different for different individuals? Of course they will. But you will see a trend generally revealing itself to exist that most of us have relatively the same ingredients and mixes to our recovery. And that's how we can fellowship. And when our programs differ, these are ways that we can learn from each other as well too. We don't have to silo ourselves and compartmentalize ourselves with ridiculous things like, oh, I kicked fentanyl. You wouldn't understand. You only kicked booze. Or I kicked booze, you wouldn't understand. You only kicked meth. Hey, you know what I'm saying? Like, the thread that ties and binds us all is the pain and that intimate connection with the suffering that only an addict or an alcoholic knows. Should be the thing that remains forefront in our minds, because this is literally a brotherhood, right? I short of removing myself from the earth or any and all ways to allow my addiction to manifest in real time, I haven't been presented with, haven't found a whole lot of other options about how to make this thing work. Now, and this is, and let me preface this with this. I see, acknowledge, and appreciate one's desire to connect by way of relating, right? Sometimes the way that this happens isn't helpful. In a person's mind, especially one who, again, is adjacent to the experience of addiction, they're not going to understand the difference between an addiction to heroin, fentanyl, alcohol, meth, or whatever, than what they define as an addiction to, I don't know, whatever it might be. And I hear people in an attempt, I think, and this is a genuine attempt to relate, compare and say, oh, I understand addiction in this way because we all have our versions of addictions. They're so diametrically opposed, what you're defining as addiction and what we have lived. This is not only a spiritual, or pardon me, a physical and mental disease. This is also a spiritual disease. This isn't something that... I'm not going to say that because I don't want to belittle anyone and I don't want to make anyone feel small. And I want to be as thoughtful as I can while kind of guiding people to avoid making this mistake when they're trying to relate with people. In this case, I almost said sometimes, but in the case where you are not, I'll just say it like this, where you are not a person in recovery from drugs or alcohol. I know that they're both drugs. It's just, this is the way that it's been referred to forever since I was a kid. But if you're not a person in recovery from drugs and alcohol, I would caution you on making comparisons to addictions to things that you define as addictions in your life when we're talking about drug and alcohol addiction, substance use disorder. They're not the same thing. Please stop doing that. There's a couple of things that you're doing when you do this. I know that you think that you're making a connection, but you are not. As an addict, when I hear a non-addicted person or a non-impacted person say this or make these kind of references or connections, trying to connect, I instantly, right away, there's a wall that goes up. And you're not going to be able to break it down. Because I know in that minute that you are completely out of touch and disconnected from any form of reality that I've lived when it comes to substance use disorder. It is completely appropriate for that space to not be filled with anything. You can find other ways to connect with people on a human level that don't involve these non-equivalent comparisons. Right? The same thing goes for racial. I deal with this all of the time. And I don't see this happening. I mean, granted, I'm only evaluating my direct environment when it comes to these things. But I do not, or I have not observed this happening when I watch members of other BIPOC communities advocate or highlight issues for their respective communities, right? Well, I do see this happen when well, maybe it's just when I do it because I present it in a way that makes people feel like they need to sound smart and connected and oppressed, and we need to go to these trauma Olympics together, which is crazy. But again, to highlight the mistake that is made with the non-equivalent comparisons, it's going to be really tough to find a version of reality where a lifestyle or sexual preference experience is comparable to a racial equality issue, especially if we're talking about black issues. Because black people I acknowledge that indigenous people and Chinese people and Irish people at times and everyone has suffered since the formation of this country, but I can only speak to black issues. I can't champion all issues because the champion of all issues has the weakest stance, if that makes sense. So speaking specifically to black issues, you cannot compare, for example, LGBTQ plus issues to black issues. Don't do it. If in that moment, when someone highlights black issues or Latino issues or whatever, anything to do with race and equality issues that have plagued this country since its inception, do your best to just connect on a human level, and sometimes that can mean just being quiet. Don't insert yourself in what you think to be an equivalent experience because you will fail every single time. Unless you have a shared experience and you're from that community. Because they're just different. It is a mistake. I don't do that to people. I don't do that when I hear other communities highlight and advocate for themselves and highlight their issues. I don't do that. I reserve comment because it's not my time to insert a non-equivalent comparison. Just because I want to feel relevant. Or I want to make a connection. Presence indicates intent and connection. And so does silence in allowing a platform to be what it was intended to be. And that doesn't include you or your experience. Most, if not all of the time, it's going to require you to just be quiet. Point is, in those moments where you experience that bit of anxiety, and you want to fill that kind of tense space with comfort and compassion, be still for a minute. Allow the energy in the room to guide you. Allow the other people or person in the room to guide you. And sometimes it's best that you just acknowledge and say that you understand. There's no need for a version of your oppression to be in addition to the conversation. What does that mean? It does not mean that you don't have a voice or that you shouldn't have a voice. It just means that decency and a bit of social awareness and basic etiquette should indicate to you that this isn't, it's just timing. There's a real value to being able to measure timing, right? And distance. Because one thing for certain that I know, when this happens to me, like I said, in an instant, it just solidifies for me the precise, mind you, but the precise time and subject where you disconnect. And the conversation turns inward and you make it self-interest driven. Because I don't know. I won't speculate as to why. I use you, but I don't mean you in particular, but I should choose more careful language. I don't understand why in those circumstances people feel a need. And I've been guilty of it too. Why sometimes in those instances people feel the need to fill that space with something. Like silence isn't something, or like it's not appropriate. It is completely okay to just let something hang out there. Just let it hang there. Just let it ruminate. Just let it kick it. Let it air out. Let it breathe. Let the idea breathe. Let the feelings, the ones that are just under the surface, let those kind of start to shake out. Let things settle. You don't always need to have this direct control. And what that also tells me is you are not driven by an internal locus of control. It matters more to you what the people in your direct environment think about how you feel and how oppressed you might be and how adept you are to making connections with people. From my experience, just speaking for myself, from my experience, I've seen through reflection mostly is when my sight is best on this, but I've seen that this has cost me connections to people. Like I say, it certainly has. Because that anxious, reflexive need to respond with, oh my God, that was traumatic. Let me relate to you in a way that, without thinking it through, feels right in the moment. It's a mistake. It's a big mistake. I had written something. I've written a few things that I wanted to share. I think I might share this. Let me see. I wrote this the other day, and I almost shared it, and I stopped, and I'm not sure why. I do understand. Part of the reason why is being completely transparent. There's like this part of me inside, that bounces between bits of conversations and statements that I've gotten from different people about my writing, books, and et cetera, and correct audiences and stuff like that. And I've always had a bit of a struggle with, at least when it comes to writing, feeling like I have to define, or I should define, like a target audience. So I feel like art that way will find its people, if that makes sense. I don't know. So, and then there's other elements to it too. Like there's, no lie. I know that in a lot of areas of my life, I have a lot of confidence. I'm able to use a lot of confidence. Even if I'm scared or apprehensive about something, I will do it anyway. Mostly, I do stuff like that just to prove to myself that on the other side, that A, I could do it, and B, that even if I did receive harsh judgment or criticism, it didn't feel as awful as I thought it might. And a large reason for that is because, hey, fuck you, man. At least I tried. What are you doing? You know what I mean? But that kind of like trick on psychology really helped. And it's not really even a trick, it's just some reality. But anyway, I wrote this the other day. I wasn't going to share, but here it goes. Let me see. Yet strangely enough, after years of the passage of time, only a moment has gone by. All along searching for a definition of this thing, this power, only to have it remain unidentified. I suppose such is the dynamic nature of things like this. This is the comedy in tragedy, living to leave it all behind. Hastening our trip to the finish, ever the intrepid little lemmings we are. Now you're going to have to play that back because I'm not reading it again. And I think that is pretty self-explanatory. Anyway, man, that's my 10 cents and $3.10 on abstinence, addiction, recovery, as individuals in our personal life and professional, how we choose to relate to people. I think that sometimes some of us are really good at it. I'm not saying I'm the best at it. I am in a unique space because I am the people that I serve. Like literally, we come from the same neighborhoods. We come from the same background. We come from the same socioeconomic status. And in our adult lives, we come from this same exact community of addicted populations, right? So I'm literally working with myself, and I get to see the different stages of me along the way. One more thing before I go. I was talking to someone about that thing yesterday, and I shared this sentiment about working at Detox and how fortunate I felt that was, because we were talking and that seemed like it would be difficult, right? Like if I were another person, and maybe it would be, it's not for everybody, but for me, what it represented was an opportunity for me to go and practice this work, services, in the important work of meeting people at ground zero, like where willingness meets withdrawal syndrome in reality, and that cascade of emotion that just comes down on you like a tsunami of steel and concrete, and it just increases and becomes progressively more aggressive until suddenly it breaks, right? And like the clouds begin to part and you come out of all of that. But being fortunate enough to be there in that moment and looking at people and being like, damn, I'm literally looking at myself, whether it was a year, however long I had in the program, right? Whether it was a year, 2 years, 3 years, the further I get away from my last use. And one of the reasons why I still love to do this work is two birds with one stone. It keeps me in a realistic point, like keeps me 100% grounded. Like if there's ever any doubt in my mind, like, oh, you know what I'm saying? Like, withdrawal wasn't that bad, bro. Yes, the fuck it was. Bro, yes, the fuck it was. Or active addiction really didn't create that much drama in my life. Like, bro, yes, the fuck it did. Do you want to come back and sit in these courtrooms again and do all this crazy stuff? No, you don't. So let's do our best to keep these things in the forefront of our mind. But anyway, that's what it meant for me. And it means that even though I have over 5 years, my life could change. That's how far away. That's the distance between me and that version of my life. Arm's length. As far as I would need to reach for that first drug or next drink. That's wild, man. That's wild. And I'm supremely grateful. You know, I'm not perfect by any means, but shit, brother, doing way better than I used to. Hey, man, if you didn't do it on the way in, think about doing it on the way out. Hit that like, subscribe, post notification bell. And this was just put on my heart. If you're afraid to talk about God, you need to take a bigger trip inside, bro. If God makes you uncomfortable, take a bigger trip inside. Peace, y'all.